Hello. Thank you all for picking this talk and playing favorites. I know that the talk selection here is so good, like I just really want to leave my talk and actually go and see, like, duck into the other talks because they all look so good in this slot. So I'm Liam, and today I'm going to be talking about empowering creatives to leverage market knowledge for optimal outcomes. In this presentation, we're going to learn to action self-disruptive techniques. I'm going to teach you to remain agile in our blue ocean industry. We'll do a deep dive on alternative solutions to creative ideation for authentic markets. We're going to explore how to promote effective synergy between you and your micro-influencers. We're going to expose new operationalized research models for creative delivery. Because the harsh reality is, traditional creative paradigms are dead. It's time to liaise with brave new techniques. Because your ROI is my passion. So let's get on the same page here. What the actual fuck was that? Like, let's try that again. What we have to say, writing, and the way that we say it, narrative, are massively influenced by who we're writing for. Hello, marketing. So my talk is called, excuse me, I think there's been a mistake. Is that marketing in my narrative? As I mentioned, my name's Liam. I work at the Game Developers Association of Australia. I run Game Connect Asia Pacific, which is the Australian Game Developers Conference. I was the co-founder of GX Australia. I worked at Obsidian, I've worked at Beamdog, and I'm a narrative designer slash writer slash producer, and I consult with companies all over Australia, in New Zealand, and overseas. So the question that I'm sure you're all asking, it's like, why the fuck is marketing relevant to narrative? What is the connection? How does that work? And it's actually a fairly simple answer, really, because we create games for an audience. No matter if you're creating a game for commercial intent or for artistic intent, usually we're creating it for someone else. It's not us. Anytime you make something for someone else, marketing is a crucial consideration, no matter what part of the pipeline you're in, whether you're in art, writing, design, you need to have an understanding of how marketing works. Because you need to understand your audience. And this is kind of where market research comes in. And this is a very corporate term, right? And it's a term that immediately turns people off. Just like personal branding, this is a corporatized term for something that's actually very simple, which is just like understanding the market, understanding the group of people that you're creating something for. We need to know who our audience is, and we need to understand them. So who are we making our games for? Because we can't write, we can't create unless we know our audience. Why do we need to know our audience? Well, it's because we want to create stories that resonate, engage, and evoke a response. In order to be able to do that, we have to understand how they think, how they work. We need to have their context. We need to understand the context, particularly like the fictional context in which they sit. So that means, what books have they read? What games have they played? What is their knowledge of current politics? What pop culture do they understand? Are they obsessed with memes? Where do they spend their time? Are they Twitter or Facebook? How do they communicate? All of this is their fictional context, the context that we place them in when we're talking about fiction. So we'll get to that later. But I understand that a lot of the time when we're creating products, we honestly don't really know who our audience is beyond maybe a brief descriptor. So we might say, like, my audience is men 18 to 45. They enjoy the shooter genre. They are probably, middle class. They're probably American. That's not an audience. That's like a fucking broad demographic. So how do we actually identify an audience? And this should be the first thing you do. Like, before you ever actually create anything, you need to understand who you're creating it for. So to repeat that, if you don't know your audience, how can you create for them successfully? whether you've done it beforehand or maybe you're still trying to work out who your audience now is, this is going to be a marketing talk. Sorry. I'm not really that sorry. Marketing is so important. Because you want to pick an audience that's large enough to support you, but niche and specific. So how do we define an audience, particularly from a narrative context? One way is demographic segmentation. It's all about finding differences between people based on basic characteristics. I mean, this is really very straightforward. It's like age, industry, gender, ethnicity, location, hobbies, interests. These are what we're familiar with. Another way of doing this is behavioral segmentation, which is about differences in behavior. And this is also incredibly useful, particularly as writers. What's the average gaming session length for a particular group? What about the time spent on public transport? What about the amount of toilet breaks per day? What time of day do they play games? How do they prefer to engage with other players and our content? We need to know all of this because it helps us understand people better. And it's really just about finding ways to separate the pie, right? We're just trying to find ways that we can identify a specific group of people. So why segment audiences? Well, there's two primary reasons. One, we want to increase our likelihood of commercial success most of the time. Like, we want to actually sell our games. We want to create experiences that resonate and affect people at a deep emotional level. We want to speak to them. And two is so we can know which channels we need to use to reach that audience. So a specific audience might only ever spend time on certain parts of Twitter. Or maybe there are certain groups on Facebook. Maybe they don't use online at all. Maybe gardening magazines is their only connection to the world, and that's how we need to reach that audience. So these are the two things, and I'm going to focus on the first one. So who has played this? Who hasn't played this? Who doesn't know what this is? Okay, so Dream Daddy is, oddly enough, a dad dating simulator. It is a very human, which is a weird term to use, a very human dating sim, I guess. It was created in the US. It's published by Game Grumps, of all people. It was created by a team that was made up of lots of queer developers, and they felt like there was a gap in the market. And the thing that I love about Dream Daddy is that these are smart people who knew their audience incredibly well. Partially that was because a lot of them were the audience, but they did you play through and it's very clear that they've spent a lot of time considering who their audience is and how to engage with them. They're 16 to 40, they're highly tech savvy. A lot of them are social media mavens. They probably are very familiar with contemporary memes and cultural ideas. A lot of them are queer people and women who enjoy romance and strong character-based narratives, and they don't really give a shit about systemic gameplay at all. They play for connection. They play for exploration. They play because they want to understand themselves and the human condition better. In contrast, we have a game like Uncharted, which is also highly specific. This is 18 to 30. It's men, consumers of the adventure genre. A lot of them will have grown up with Indiana Jones. Again, they're tech savvy. They understand contemporary genres. They watch a lot of contemporary movies, and they're on the latest consoles. So how do you find an audience? This is a really complicated question. In fact, it's the $1 million question, quite literally sometimes. But that's a whole other talk, and I'm not going to go into that. But the quick version is, unless you intend to make a game entirely for you, you are not your audience. You could be a part of the audience, but it's important that you don't make unsubstantiated assumptions based on your own knowledge, because you are not a great objective model for anything, especially something you're creating. So it's really important that you give yourself an alternative framework to help make decisions by. But the basics to finding an audience is there's a couple of things. There's a lot of research involved. You have to pay attention. You have to understand what's going on in the market, which just means what kind of games are coming out. And then find the gaps. Where are groups of people that aren't being created for. Dream Daddy was successful because their target market was not often sold to. These were people who were highly engaged. They like sharing content. They're highly communicative, but not a lot of people were targeting them. And a lot of people weren't targeting them with authentic content. Like, I know that sounds like bullshit, but like stuff that means something to them, that really was created specifically for them. Because when we play something that's specifically for us, that's special. That's when we get genuine, like, emotional experiences. It's when we take away things. It's when we learn about ourselves. And all of this marketing bullshit speak, that's what it's about. It's about creating connections between people. So for this, we need to find ways to validate our assumptions. It's really important that we don't just go with our gut. As creatives, it's often, like, I know what I'm writing, I'm like, that joke is really funny. I'm so smart. Like, this is great. And I'll write the joke in and it'll be fine. And then like, I'll actually, like, I'll send it off to like someone who is in the target audience. And they'll be like, I don't get it. And I'll be like, yeah, but like it references like this joke from like a meme like 3 weeks ago. Like, it's fucking hilarious. And they'll be like, oh, yeah, but I don't spend time on Twitter. Like, how on earth was I meant to have the context for that? Even though I understand that and I'm a part of that audience, doesn't mean that I, actually have the framework to be able to make those decisions. I have to look outside myself. And I shouldn't make assumptions about how people operate and what frameworks they have. So let's pretend, for the sake of the argument, that we've all got an audience to create for. It's time to do some learnings. Market research, woo! Yeah, this is also really boring, sorry. Market research just means like spending a lot of time learning about the people that you're creating for. And this can be super boring, or it can actually be super interesting, and it's kind of up to you how you frame it to yourself. I prefer to think of it as like getting to know people, and I'm a super social person. I'm super curious about how people work and human psychology and all that kind of stuff. So for me, this is super interesting. Like, I want to understand these people, because the more that I understand about them, like, the better job I can do. So we need to understand who these people are. What kind of media do they consume? How do they consume it? Do they spend a lot of time on TV? How do they watch their TV? Do they spend lots of time like watching Netflix shows? Do they prefer serialized shows? Do they prefer shows that have long character arcs that take place over several seasons? Do they prefer standalone episodes? And then we can look at games. What kind of games do they play? Like, do they consume games through the mobile? Like, look at all of these things. These are all really important. And again, I'm going to use this word, like fictional context. We need to understand what's around them. It's just what they're familiar with. Where are they placed in the grand scale of like world fiction? Understanding their play behaviors, play session length, platform, etc., is also really important. A really great example of this is actually Mass Effect 2. Mass Effect 2, it was brilliantly designed in that the quests in that game were specifically designed around the average playtime length. So it's bite-sized chunks. So you can complete a section of the game, a quest, whatever you want to call it, in probably a 20 to 30 minute time frame. And then you can chain those. And it doesn't feel artificial. You feel like you're just moving through the story naturally. But at any point, you can really kind of break away as long as it's within one of those chunks. And they structure the game so that it's like you're given these chunks in fair, equitable doses, so that you never feel bored, you never feel like you're being strung along. You're just engaged through that period. A whole little story is told in that time. And the reason that they do that is because that's how their audience works. And that greatly affects how we structure our narratives and how we tell our stories. Plus, we need to know like every other characteristic. What's their behavior? What other useful data points can we find to help us focus and make decisions about games narrative? Like, what's their knowledge of our genre? If I'm creating a zombie shooter, what other zombie shooters have they played? Like, how have they played those games? What platforms have they played them on? How is the narrative in that game expressed? what other media do they consume in that category? Are they zombie fans? Do they like go to shows and cosplay as zombies? What attracts them to zombies, like the zombie genre? Is it the post-apocalyptic? Is it the human tragedy of post-apocalyptic settings? Is it the more like hilarious Fallout style, irony of those situations? Understanding where they're coming from is so important. What references or frameworks are they familiar with that we can draw upon? Again, this is just about like what's in their world. This is one that we don't often talk about, but like what kind of vernacular are they familiar with? So if I'm going to create for a really young audience, obviously the words, the language that they use is very different to what I use. Every time I go home and talk to my younger brother, it's a horrifying time where I have to relearn an entirely new language and then like try to translate what he's saying into, like human speak. And, of course, if I try to speak that language, I sound like an idiot. But for him, like that's what he's familiar with. That's his local vernacular. And again, like what kinds of stories do they enjoy? What structures? What kind of characters do they identify with? Every group prefers different kinds of characters, different ways of telling stories. For people who really like RPGs, they often enjoy like involved character arcs. Like the party-based system is a really important part of why they play those games. So if you're considering making an RPG and you're thinking about the overall narrative, and you're going for that audience, you know that you need to consider like long character arcs and have those characters have meaning in the story, have their personal plot be relevant to what's going on in the world around them. Bio and Obsidian do this really well. They think of characters as ciphers for the game's problem. So usually each character represents like a particular facet of the theme of the game. And they're often very different. And so they'll represent like different areas, different ideas. And hopefully as a player, you never notice, but it overall like informs your experience of that game and appeals to you specifically as a target of that demographic. How do they like story expressed? Do they like light exposition, heavy exposition? People who love Planescape Torment do not like COD. People who like COD style of storytelling do not play like Planescape Torment because the sheer amount of exposition overwhelms them. They can't function. They're not able to take in that story. They're not able to like understand that narrative, and they're not going to enjoy it. So how do they consume that content? It's really important to read marketing data, do interviews with your target audience, read social media, do anything you can to gain a better understanding of how these people work. And make sure that it's separate to you. Because, again, like most of the time you're not your audience. And even if you are your audience, there's probably some differences there that you're not aware of. And we do all of this because we need to know what their expectations are. We need to know when they go into an experience, what do they expect? So if we don't know our audience, how can we expect to create good content for them? You have to know your audience. Another really important thing is what other games do our audience like? So if you're going to create, you've been asked to create a narrative for a point-and-click adventure game set on the moon. It's a sci-fi, and it's going to be kind of, it's like got Battlestar Galactica style narrative. What other games is that audience likely to have played? Like maybe they'll have played the game that was just released out of Perth. I think it's Deadlock, Battlestar Galactica Deadlock. How did that story go? How was it expressed? What kind of character elements did they use? What kind of exposition occurred? Do they have a lot of text? Do they not have a lot of text? How was the narrative structured? It's important to do competition research. How are other games telling stories? How is it being written? Why? What tropes do they employ? What character archetypes do they include and why? Because this is different for like almost every audience. We like to think that character archetypes are kind of cross-demographic. That's not really a word. But you know, there's these specific character types that everyone enjoys. But the reality is like, we're all super fucking different. And we're all going to enjoy different things. So understanding the kinds of characters, the kinds of story structures that our audience like, as opposed to other groups, is going to be really relevant to us as writers and designers. There are like some mixed up slides here. So once we have all of this research, How do we use this knowledge? So it turns out knowledge gives us a framework for decision making. This is hugely useful. It means that every time we reach a decision point in a project, particularly when it comes to writing a narrative, we can then use our body of knowledge that we've accumulated to inform that decision-making process. So if we are creating a sci-fi shooter, and we know that players of these games only enjoy narratives that are between 6 and 8 hours in length, but the content that we've created is more like 12. And we need to restructure that because the team's gone, we actually hate this narrative. We need to completely scrap every piece of writing we've done. We've got all of these levels. We've got all of this content. We need to rethink this story. You know that you need to be able to create a narrative that fits within like that 6 to 8 hour point that changes how you structure the narrative and probably even how you tell that narrative. It changes how you convey information and exposition, like drastically. So maybe your audience can't read. That means you need VO. When you're writing for VO, it's incredibly different to writing for reading. The way that we structure text for dialogue varies like a lot between when you're writing for spoken word versus writing for the page. Because if we actually write for spoken word and people just read it on the page, it sounds wrong in our heads. It doesn't sound correct. It is over-expressive. But if we listen to it, it sounds totally naturalistic. And vice versa. If we write for reading, it's going to sound really weird if we read it out. And so these kinds of decisions are hugely informed by knowledge of our audience. And knowing what people expect is super powerful. It's one of the most powerful things we can have as writers. We need to be able to understand their expectations because we need to meet those expectations, exceed them, and then fuck with them. The best way to engage somebody in any story is to surprise them, to make jokes, to have suspense. And all of these are predicated on expectation. If we don't know what our audience actually expects, how the hell are we going to create something for them? Some other things we have to keep in mind are, language, vernacular, reading level, and complexity. Again, if you're writing for a 60-year-old man in Kentucky and a 30-year-old woman in Virginia, like those are two very different audiences with very different reading levels. And style. This is a really important one as well, and one that we don't often consider. The way in which we write also informs how our audience takes in information. Pillars of Eternity, for example, when we were writing that, we were asked to write it very, I think the directive from Eric, the lead narrative designer, was, I want every sentence to sound unique. I want it to be a unique sentence in the English language. And what that created was a really interesting style that was very flowery and often over the top. Which for that specific audience who like, single-player RPGs that are party-based, that are older, that harken back to like Baldur's Gate, etc., that's kind of what they enjoy. They like the delight of being like, fuck, I've never heard that sentence before. What a clever construction. But honestly, for most people, they don't give a shit. In fact, it actively detriments their experience. It's over the top. It's flowery. I don't need to know that. I just need to know what I need to do. You need to look at your narrative. You need to look at your audience and work out if they're a good fit. I often find building sort of core narrative pillars from my knowledge of that audience to be really, really useful, and then to refer back to those really regularly. What are we basing our decisions on? What are we basing our assumptions on? Back them the fuck up. Don't make decisions without information. If you're creating, especially for a commercial intent for a specific audience, and you don't fully understand that audience, you don't understand what they expect, what they like, what they don't like, you're not going to be able to create something successfully for them. It's not going to work. So the key takeaway for this talk, and we're going to do a bit of an exercise after this, is this. What we have to say, writing, and how we say it, narrative, are massively influenced by who we're writing for. In order to create effective narrative for games, did you want to take a photo of that slide? That's fine. And in order to create effective narrative, we need to know our audience, know who they are, and then we need to understand their context. Thank you very much. So I'm going to do a Q&A at the end, but I'm going to do it through Twitter. So if you have questions for me, please send them through Twitter, and I will respond to them later. Or if you have a longer question or you want to have a chat, you can email me. So let's make a game. So I think that this is one of those cases where it's very easy to talk about, but understanding how it works in practice is kind of different, right? So we have, let's say, let's spend 10 minutes or so just having a good time and creating an experience, and I'll try to illustrate how we can use this information to create good ideas. So let's start with a genre. We're going to do a shooter. And I'm going to get you all to contribute to this too. But the basic setting, the brief, is that it's a shooter where instead of guns, you're a group of kids playing with water pistols. And it's framed as though you're the underdogs fighting against the great and terrible popular kids. Let's define this audience a little, okay? So it's going to be kids, 8 to 12, boys and girls. That's what we've been told. That's all the information we've been given, and that's just not good enough, right? That is not enough information to be able to make many decisions with. We need to be more specific. We need to drill down. We need to find out who these kids are. What do they like? So for this kind of game, what's the, you think through recent history, what's the experience that's most like this that's come out in the last few months?
Splatoon?
Yep, Splatoon. So chances are, the kids who want to play this game, our audience, probably play Splatoon. And by leading on from that, they're probably Nintendo fans. They have a Switch, or they have a Wii U. Okay, so they have a handheld console. That probably means they also have a 3DS, depending on their age. Let's drill down a little bit deeper. For these families, how many kids are in it? You can look this stuff up. What's the average number of kids in a household? Yep. So, okay, so they have siblings. What does that give us? What does that mean? Yep. Yep. So, okay, so suddenly you're getting that kind of stuff. You're getting more information. These aren't narrative decisions. These are just design decisions. But they're going to give us a little bit of context. Okay, so let's get more specific. What kind of stuff do you think, for this game, we're creating you're shooting each other with water guns. It's probably highly stylized, let's say. What other stuff can we add to this? What kind of kids are going to be interested in this? Are we going to target it at boys or girls? Both? Well, that's pretty broad. How are we going to target it at both, do you think? Yeah.
Depends on whether or not the game is entirely about shooting, or if there's also a creative element. Can you create your own environment?
Yep.
Is there a collection element? Can you create different skins, different weapons? So all of these things will impact the genders that you are attacking.
Yeah, absolutely. Another really interesting fact is that so young girls really care if there's a female protagonist. They won't often play a game where there's a male protagonist. Young boys don't give a shit. Statistically speaking, they don't care. What does that tell us? If we're going to create a game for both genders, it should probably have a female protagonist. So that's really interesting. You learn that through doing research about this specific demographic and how they work. So, okay, we have a female protagonist. Let's say it's a cooperative co-op game because we don't want to have too much competition. It's going to be Splatoon-like, and it'll have shooter elements. Maybe it'll have creative elements as well. So how can we narrow down this audience further? What kind of things do kids, I don't know, what do the kids like nowadays? Minecraft. Yep. So these are games that you play again and again and again. They're kind of roguelike-y. So, okay, let's incorporate a couple of roguelike elements to the design. Okay, so now we kind of have a bit of a framework. So it is a shooter where it's non-violent. It's co-op. It's friendly. There's a female protagonist. There's losers fighting against the underdogs. Underdogs fighting against the popular kids. But given that we know about this audience, what kind of other products do they consume? What are the stories that they're familiar with?
Music.
Yep. What kind of narratives does the music that they listen to tell? Because they all, like, every song tells a story, right? So think about the kind like pop music in general, like, which is going to be, especially for young girls, like that's what they're listening to. So what are the narratives that pop music targeted at young kids says?
Romantic betrayal.
Yep. What else? Yep. Particularly like the squad, girl power. Yep. Are you beginning to see how Splatoon was made? So music is a really powerful one, and it's actually a really, really good comparison point because there are so many stories in music that you don't really think about, and this is what young kids particularly are hearing, and this is what they're digesting, and it's often a good point for us to spring from when we're creating our own stories. Okay, what about movies? What movies for the last couple of years have come out? What kind of narratives are we hearing?
Hunger Games.
Yep. Oh, there's again, like, these are like strong female protagonists who are, deeply flawed but manage to overcome things. They're also like the hero's arc. So we're beginning to set some expectations for what this narrative might look like. This is what they expect from an experience, right? So at some point, we're going to want some differentiation. We're going to want to change this up a little bit. We want to surprise them. So given that we know some of these things about our audience, how are we going to give them a little surprise? What can we flip in the things that we've said? So like the hero's journey, female empowerment sort of stories, which, let's not scrap that, okay? Maybe... And it's, okay, maybe, toxic masculinity is a really interesting one for this age group too. If we want to be a little bit educational, if we want to provide some good examples, let's talk about a little bit about toxic masculinity. It's not a thing that's expected in this genre. And also, we know that, because based on the music that they listen to, romance is one of the key things. Every boy and every girl end up in a romance. That's the popular narrative. But that's just not true in real life. And it perpetuates the stereotype that men and women can't be friends. So let's fuck with that a little. Let's say that it's a male, you are a female protagonist, you're an awesome girl, and your best friend is a boy. Let's represent a positive relationship where we flip some of the gender roles a little bit and we show the villains as, being a little bit toxic. And let's explain why in our narrative, why that's the case, how that works. And let's base that on our knowledge of the music that they consume, the kind of stories that they're being told. Because one really interesting thing about expectation is when we hear tropes, we actually get, if we recognize a trope, we get a rush of endorphins. It feels good. It feels good to understand something and to be able to predict it. This is why familiarity is really powerful, because it makes us feel good. It's like a buzz for our brain. And we want to have a lot of that. We want to make sure that our audience is feeling good, that we're meeting their expectations, because that feels good. At other points, we do want to surprise them. So we are beginning to add some narrative elements to this story. We're beginning to have a bit more of a framework that's based on the kind of media that these kids consume, the kind of stories that they're being told. What about the way that narrative is being told? Because we haven't really talked about that at all. So how in games that are targeted at young kids, like particularly not too young, so like think 8 to 12, what games are there right now? There's like Splatoon, Minecraft.
Roblox.
Yeah. None of you should create children's games. Go learn more about kids' games. It's super fascinating. What else?
Animal Jam.
Yeah. Animal Crossing. What else? What kind of, how do these games do story? Maybe that's a better question. So a lot of it's like procedural. There aren't really strong narratives. Like there's definitely not a lot of exposition, and our target audience doesn't enjoy lots of exposition. Most of them don't like a lot of reading. So it means that there has to be VO for everything. It means that we can't have a vocab that's too complicated, but it has to be complicated enough to make the smart kids feel smart. What else is there? If we have to have VO, it means, and we can't have a lot of text, it changes the kind of stories that we can tell. We can have maybe like Night in the Woods style interactions where there's like little conversations between characters. We could look at Overwatch, which is also actually quite popular with this age group, particularly watching their parents play. And know that like so much story can be told just through the way that characters speak when they do actions. So like character action lines are an amazing way to tell narrative. They're an amazing way to set the scene for things. So we can have cutscenes, of course, but actually a lot of those kids don't like those cutscenes in games. You'll notice that like in most of the games that we sort of mentioned, they don't have cutscenes, so let's scrap them. No cutscenes. This is just going to be purely gameplay because that's what they enjoy. They want to get into the action. They want to be doing things. They want to be having fun. Do you see where I'm getting at here? Like you start to like, if you look at the competitors in your field, the kind of products and media that kids are consuming, you start to get a really broad picture. And then you can get more and more specific as you go. This is the case for any target demographic. It doesn't matter who it is or what they enjoy. Understanding their context gives you so much power as a creator. And this isn't just true for narrative. It's true for, like, as I said earlier, like every part of the pipeline. For an artist, you need to know what kind of art your audience is familiar with in order to be able to create something exciting and new for them that's going to appeal to them. Because obviously, art is going to be different depending on, what demographic you're going for, what kind of age group, where in the world, etc. So, does anyone have any questions about this? I feel like I've repeated the point enough and I've bashed you over the head repeatedly. Yeah.
When it comes to like non-racing and stuff, if you have like a kind of niche game in your head, where are places that you can go to like find information if you don't know this stuff? Like, where are the places kind of go for that?
So Quantic Foundry has some really, really amazing free data available on a bunch of different games audiences. I would encourage you to look up, as a starting point, and don't take it for gospel, but Buttle's player types. Buttle was a researcher who explored different ways of playing games and different types of psychology when it comes to games. And his research has since sort of been expanded and a little bit debunked, and it's not to be taken as gospel by any means, but it's a useful starting point for understanding the psychology behind play. I would also encourage, if you haven't read Ralph Costa's The Theory of Fun, do that. More of a design thing though. Work out where they spend time and spend time in that space. So if you have a game that is Neopets-like, go spend time on the Neopets forums. Spend time with those people. Take notes. Write notes. I am a data nerd, and so I will write spreadsheets with notes on audiences that I am interested in, and that honestly, just spending time in those spaces will give you so much information. And then look beyond game stuff. Like, there is a lot of information on, like, what is out right now for kids. Like, if you're creating a game for kids, like, look at the media channels that appeal to mums, and how are they selling products to kids? What kind of products are there in that space? And then dive into those products. Like, what are those products? How do they work? How do they convey story? What kind of stories are they telling right now? Which ones of them are successful and which aren't? You start to get an idea of what works and what doesn't. And I mean, like, this is a really crucial part of the process of, like, initially targeting your audience or creating a product for an audience. And so, like, it should also be a really important part when we're creating content, when we're writing and we're creating narrative. It doesn't matter what part of the process you're in, we're still creating for an audience. And we shouldn't have some marketer off to the side who, you know, we talk to every now and then if we're lucky. And marketing isn't PR. It's not something that happens at the end of a project. Marketing is something that happens right at the beginning and all the way through. Like, every part of the team should have some understanding of who you're creating for, why you're creating it, why is it going to be successful, how does it fit amongst the sea of other titles, and understand that context. Like, that will be incredibly useful to you. It gives you constraints. It gives you different points of reference. It can really help tell you what not to do. It's a really important one. Like, often it's easy to, like, spend a lot of time on these things and kind of go, like, this just doesn't work. Like, and spend time with that audience, get them to play games, see how they react to games. Yeah.
I can also tell you in a game who not to have to. So in the kids example, a kid spends their entire day being told what to do by grown-up. So in your tutorial, you should never have an adult give the kid instructions.
Mm-hmm. There's so much stuff like that, like, so much, especially for kids, but for every demographic. Like, everyone has their biases. Understanding how those biases work through the products that they consume is super important. Any other questions?
People who work with marketing in big studios often have a hard time convincing developers that this needs to be considered and looked at. How do you convince them? How do you insert that this stuff is actually important?
Humanize it. Like, give it a human face. And think about the language that you use. The language that I used at the start of this presentation was obviously very intentional. It's a very similar message, actually, to what I'm saying now, but it's presented in a way that we don't take seriously, that's not for us, but that would be very exciting to a very specific demographic. So even though the message was still the same, the way I was telling that message, the narrative of it, was incorrect for you. And you have to kind of think like that when you're trying to convince someone of anything, right? Understand what their framework is. What language do they use to communicate? Like, listen to how they speak. How do they describe things? And kind of try to work out how you can frame it within their context. So, like, create a human element of it for them. So if you're talking to like an artist, let's say, and you're saying, like, hey, like, you can't just create the art style for a game based on your own personal preference. Give them a bunch of different games and give them data on those audiences, and then have a chat. Just be like, hey, so, like, this particular group of people, like, really likes this. Here are some of the facts and the numbers. But maybe go talk to that person. Find out why they like that art style. Or explain why you like a specific art style. Give them a point of comparison to their own thoughts. And, like, arguments and conversations with different people obviously going to function very, very differently, but understanding where they're coming from and why they think the way they do is going to give you lots of ammunition in trying to convince them. And so you just want to frame it in their language, basically. Yeah. Anyone else? Awesome. Thank you all so much for coming. I hope that I haven't repeated the message too much, and I hope that you learned something useful. If not, like, hey, there are many other good talks at NZGDC. Thanks so much for coming.